Okay, so you know that feeling you get where things just aren't adding up? Like there's more to the story than we're being told.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we all get that feeling sometimes, especially when it comes to global politics, right?
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into the relationship between Ukraine and the U.S. And let me tell you, the sources we've got are about to take us down a rabbit hole.
That's intriguing. What kind of sources are we talking about?
Well, we've got one from Alexander Dubinsky.
Dubinsky. That name rings a bell.
Yeah, he's a Ukrainian parliament member, or at least he was. He's actually been in prison for over a year now.
Wow, okay. What landed him behind bars?
His alleged crime was speaking out against corruption. He was specifically targeting the Bidens, claiming that Joe Biden was leveraging Ukraine for personal gain.
The Bidens. This is getting interesting.
Yeah, it gets pretty wild. Dubinsky claims that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, was raking in millions through some shady offshore dealings. He lays out these specific schemes, even mentioning payments that Hunter received from Ukrainian officials.
I do recall hearing something about that. Didn't the U.S. Congress even acknowledge that those payments happened?
Yep, they did. But nothing really seems to have come of it. And meanwhile, Dubinsky is stuck in prison without any evidence, without even a trial. He claims he was never even questioned. It's crazy.
That's a pretty bold move to go after such powerful figures. It makes you wonder if he's really being silenced for speaking truth to power.
Well, he doesn't stop there. Dubinsky also calls out George Soros, claiming that Soros, along with Zelenskyy and his chief of staff, interfered in the 2020 U.S. election.
Whoa, now that's a whole other can of worms.
Right.
It seems like U.S. politics and Ukrainian affairs are deeply intertwined.
You got that right. And Dubinsky takes it even further. He makes this direct plea to Trump, urging him to audit all the U.S. aid that went to Ukraine since 2020.
An audit? Why is he asking for that?
Because he claims there's widespread corruption, and that Zelenskyy is profiting from the war and has no interest in peace. He even calls Zelenskyy a dictator who's shutting down dissent and canceling elections because he's afraid of losing power.
Wow, those are some serious accusations. If true, it really makes you question where all that foreign aid is actually going.
For sure. And speaking of things being hidden from view, let's move on to our second source. This one delves into what's been called the Red Lines memo.
Red Lines memo? What's that all about?
This document was supposedly sent from the U.S. State Department to Zelenskyy right after he won the election in 2019. And let me tell you, it's explosive.
What's so explosive about it?
It lays out all these limitations on what Zelenskyy can and cannot do.
Limitations like what?
We're talking everything. Security, foreign policy, economics, national identity, the media, even religious matters. It's basically dictating how Ukraine should be run.
Hold on. Are you saying that this memo is basically undermining Ukraine's sovereignty?
That's exactly what our source is arguing. They claim this memo came from a group of Ukrainian civil society groups, but they believe these groups were actually fronts for U.S. agencies like the State Department, USIE, and even NATO.
So they're claiming it's all a facade, that these organizations are just puppets for U.S. interests.
That's the gist of it. And the memo itself is pretty damning. It prohibits Zelenskyy from negotiating with Russia independently, forces him to pursue EU and NATO membership, and prevents him from challenging any IMF agreements.
It's like they're trying to control every aspect of Ukraine's policy, both domestic and foreign.
Exactly. And it gets even creepier. The memo dictates control over the media, essentially trying to silence anyone who disagrees and shape how the public thinks. It even says that if Zelenskyy steps out of line, they'll create political instability to force him back in check.
Wow, that's some serious manipulation. It definitely connects back to what Dubinsky was saying about being silenced. If this is all true, it creates a system where the people in power benefit from maintaining the status quo, no matter how corrupt or unjust it might be.
Right. It's a pretty scary thought. And this memo goes into even more detail about what Zelenskyy is forbidden from doing.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, so get this. Zelenskyy is barred from holding a referendum about negotiations with Russia.
That's a big one, essentially taking away the Ukrainian people's right to decide how their country deals with the conflict.
Yeah. And on top of that, he's also forbidden from making any territorial concessions to Russia, even if it means achieving peace.
So even if it's in Ukraine's best interest to give up some territory in exchange for peace, he's not allowed to do it. That's incredible.
It really makes you think about who's really calling the shots here and whose interests are actually being served. And then there's the whole economic side of things.
Oh, right. What does the memo say about that?
Well, it says that Zelenskyy can't implement any policies that go against the agreements Ukraine already has with the IMF.
So essentially, The IMF is dictating Ukraine's economic policy. That's a classic example of how economic power can be used for political control.
It's pretty wild, isn't it? And it's not just the economy. This memo also goes into matters of national identity, like language and culture. It's like they're trying to mold Ukraine in a very specific way.
Can you give me some examples of how they're doing that?
Sure. So Zelenskyy is forbidden from changing the language law.
The language law, why is that such a big deal?
Well, language is super important for cultural identity. And in Ukraine, there's been a lot of debate about the use of the Russian language.
Ah, I see. So by preventing Zelenskyy from touching the language law, they're essentially trying to suppress the use of Russian and further distance Ukraine from Russia.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just language. They even forbid Zelenskyy from moving control over education out of Ukraine and giving it to an EU body.
Wait, what? That means the EU would basically control what Ukrainian kids are learning?
That's right. And it doesn't stop there. They even dictate how Zelenskyy can interact with religious institutions.
Seriously, what do they say about that?
The memo specifically forbids Zelenskyy from supporting the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which has ties to the Russian Orthodox Church.
Wow, it seems like they're trying to control every aspect of Ukrainian life, even down to their religion.
It's pretty intense, right? And the thing is, it's all being presented as if it's in the best interest of promoting democracy and freedom in Ukraine. But the level of control they're exerting is just mind-boggling.
It's a classic example of how those ideals can be twisted and manipulated. And it makes you wonder, who really benefits from all this control?
Right. It's a question worth pondering. And we haven't even touched on how this memo affects the inner workings of the Ukrainian government. There's so much more to unpack.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. This red lines memo is like a blueprint for controlling a country from the shadows. It's really making me rethink how I view international relations.
Me too. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. The more we learn, the more complex and disturbing it gets.
It's like they're saying, here's the script, Zelenskyy, don't deviate.
Right. And remember, this memo allegedly came out in 2019. This isn't some ancient history we're talking about.
That's what's so crazy about it. This is all happening right under our noses. And it's not just vague suggestions either. This memo gets into specifics about how Zelenskyy has to manage things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, remember how we talked about Zelenskyy being banned from making any concessions on territory to Russia?
Right. Even if it meant peace.
Well, there's more to that. The memo actually forbids him from fulfilling any ultimatums coming from Russia.
So basically, no matter what Russia demands, Zelensky's hands are tied.
It's like they're setting him up to fail. And then there's this whole thing about Ukraine joining the EU and NATO.
Oh, yeah. The memo's very clear about that. No delays, no sabotage, just a straight shot to membership.
Which, again, takes away Zelensky's ability to decide what's best for Ukraine. It's like they're saying, this is the path, you have no choice.
It really raises questions about the whole concept of Ukrainian sovereignty, doesn't it?
Totally. And let's not forget about the economic side of things. Remember, the memo also prohibits Zelenskyy from implementing any policies that go against existing agreements with the IMF.
Right, which basically means the IMF is calling the shots on Ukraine's economy.
And it's not just about following some broad guidelines. The memo actually goes into detail about specific policies that Zelenskyy is forbidden from changing.
Like what?
Well, for example, there's this whole section about how Zelenskyy can't touch anything related to the privatization of land in Ukraine.
Privatization of land. What's the significance of that?
It's a huge issue in Ukraine. There are a lot of powerful interests who want to see agricultural land privatized so they can profit from it.
Ah, I see. So by preventing Zelenskyy from changing the policies around land privatization, they're essentially protecting those interests.
Exactly. And it's all done under the guise of, promoting economic stability and attracting foreign investment.
Mm-hmm.
But who's really benefiting?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And we haven't even gotten to the parts about national identity and culture. This memo is like a masterclass in manipulation.
It really is. And the details are just crazy. Like, remember how we talked about the language law? Well, the memo goes even deeper into that. It forbids Zelenskyy from changing anything about the status of the Russian language in Ukraine.
Wow, so not only can he not review the language law, but he can't even address the broader issue of the Russian language in Ukraine.
Nope. And it's not just about language. They're also dictating what happens with education. Remember how we mentioned that Zelenskyy is forbidden from transferring ownership of education to an EU body?
Right.
Well, the memo also states that he can't create any new educational institutions that are outside of state control.
So basically, they're trying to make sure that the Ukrainian government maintains a tight grip on education.
Exactly. They want to control what Ukrainian kids are learning shaping their worldview from a young age.
It's all about control, isn't it? And they're doing it in such a subtle way. It's not like they're overtly saying, we're taking over your country. They're doing it through these seemingly innocuous policies and agreements.
And that's what makes it so insidious, because on the surface, it all sounds reasonable. But when you start digging deeper, you realize that there's a whole other agenda at play.
And this memo doesn't just dictate policy, it dictates how Zelenskyy has to interact with different groups and institutions.
Oh yeah, that's one of the most interesting parts. Remember how the memo says he has to ignore dialogue with civil society?
Right, but our source argues that civil society is actually code for organizations controlled by the U.S. State Department, the CIA, and NATO.
Exactly. So it's not about genuine dialogue. It's about making sure Zelenskyy only listens to those who are aligned with U.S. interests.
It's like they're saying, we have our people in place, make sure you listen to them.
Right. And the memo even gets specific about how Zelenskyy has to interact with these organizations. Like, it says he has to meet with them regularly and give them access to information.
It's crazy. They're essentially dictating how he runs his government. And they're doing it all under the pretense of promoting democracy and transparency.
It's a perfect example of how those concepts can be weaponized. And it makes you wonder what other red lines are out there. What other countries are being manipulated in this way?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And it really underscores the importance of critical thinking and questioning the narratives that we're being fed.
It's amazing, isn't it? You start with these accusations of corruption, and then you end up uncovering this whole web of international intrigue. It's like something out of a spy novel.
It really is. And the thing is, both of these sources, Dubinsky and this Red Lines memo, they both point to the same unsettling question. Who really holds the power in Ukraine?
Right. Like, is Ukraine truly a sovereign nation if its leader is essentially being told what to do by a foreign power? It makes you question the whole idea of democracy and self-determination.
Exactly. And remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a real war, a war with global consequences. It's not just some abstract political debate. There are real lives at stake here.
That's what makes it so disturbing. If these allegations are true, it means that the fate of Ukraine, the peace negotiations, the humanitarian aid, it's all being influenced by these hidden agendas.
And the ordinary people of Ukraine, they're the ones caught in the middle of all this. They're the ones suffering the most.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that these power struggles, these geopolitical games, they always come at a cost. And it's often the most vulnerable who end up paying the price.
And that's why it's so important to bring these issues to light. We need to expose these hidden agendas, hold the powerful accountable, and make sure that the voices of the people are heard.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? To provide a platform for these alternative perspectives, to challenge the mainstream narratives, and to encourage people to think critically about what's really going on in the world.
Right, because knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and demand change.
Well said. This deep dive into Ukraine and U.S. influence has been eye-opening, to say the least. We started with some pretty wild accusations, and we ended up uncovering a whole web of intrigue that goes far deeper than we could have imagined.
It's a story that's still unfolding, too. There are so many unanswered questions.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to keep asking questions, and to never stop seeking the truth. Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.